Hello. In this session, we're going to use Flex model-driven development to create a Flex application that contains a data model. The data model will be deployed to the experience server, and then the application will be able to store data in the CRX Content Repository. So before we get started, let's take a look first at one of the preferences for model-driven development. When using the CRX Content Repository, it's important to select Content as the deployment handler in this preference setting. Now let's create a new Flex project. I'll create a Flex project for ADEP Experience Services, and what this means is that I will have all of the default build preferences and availability of SDK libraries that I need for building my project using the Experience server. So let's give the project a name. Notice that we're using the Experience server, and I'm going to leave all of the other properties as default. So in our newly created project, the first thing that we're going to do is to create a data model. Now, every Flex project actually has the concept of a default data model, and you can see that through the icon here. So I'm going to use this icon just to manage the default model for this project. So now we have the canvas for creating a new model. I'll first of all create a new entity in the model by dragging it into the canvas. Let's give the entity a name. I'll call it a car. The entity has an ID by default, but let's add a couple of other properties. Let's give it a name. Let's give it a make. And let's give it a license. Okay, so this is a very simple model with one entity, and we're ready now to deploy this model to the Experience server. To do that, I just use the deploy icon here within the data modeler. Now, data modeler will ask me to save the data model first as part of my Flex project, and then I get the option to deploy it to the server. Now, it's important, as before, to make sure that we've selected the Experience server as the target server that we're ready to deploy the model to. The other options I will just leave as default. So now that my model has been deployed, I can look at the Data Services view here in Flash Builder that shows me the services that have been created for the entities in my model. Now I only have one entity, it's called car, and so I have a car service. And the car service exposes some operations that are called CRUD operations, for example, create, read, update, delete, as well as filter operations that are used to query data based on that entity. So we can now use this service to help us build a Flex application to manage data in the content repository using this entity. So to do that, I'm going to go back to my MXML application, and let's go back to the design view for this MXML application. So right now the application is empty, but what I can start to do is to build the application with some of the facilities that model-driven development provides within Flash Builder. So one of those is to create forms used for the create operation. So if I select create car, I'll find that there's an option here called generate form. So there are different types of forms that you can select, but I'm just going to select a simple form, and I'll accept all of the other defaults. In addition, what I can do is drill into the properties that the form will help me gather data for. And I actually don't want to gather an input for the ID property because I know that the server will generate these IDs automatically. So I'm going to deselect that. So now the form has been created for me with a button that will actually generate a call to the create car operation. In fact, I can even check that. If I right-click on the button and look at the click handler, you can see back in the code that there has been a function generated for this purpose. Now, I can also see that because I'm using data management, I want to uncomment out part of that code. This, by the way, will allow us to create a new object every time the create operation is used. So let's go back to the design view again. Now the next thing I'll need in my application is some view of the existing data. So to do that, I'm just going to use a simple data grid. So let's drag and drop a data grid onto our canvas. And let's make it a little wider. Now, in order to bind some data from our service into the data grid, I simply need to drag and drop again from the relevant operation into this data grid. So I'll pick the getAll operation and drag it into the data grid. I'll select the default options. And now our data grid has been bound to the data returned from the getAll operation, which is a list of cars. So now with my form generated for creating new instances of cars and my data grid bound to the get operation to fetch cars, I'm ready to run my application. Now to do this, I'm just going to launch it right within Flash Builder. Remember also that when using the Experience server, the application actually gets deployed into the CRX Content Repository, and then Flash Builder launches a URL pointing to that application running on your server. So here's the application running, so let's test it out. So there's one. And there's another. So that's good, but let's take a look at where this data is actually going in the repository. To do that, I'm just going to go back into CRX DE Lite and have a look. So that can be found under the content folder, and here we have sample application, which is actually the name of the application that I first created. Here is a content node called car, matching the name of the entity that I created in my model. And here's all the instance data for the 2 cars that I created. And you can see the properties here stored as JCR properties on each of these nodes. Thank you.